As night falls over a country that has just passed through great upheavals, history, too, learns to speak more softly. China in the late 1970s was such a space, vast, exhausted, and strangely silent. The slogans that had once shaken the entire society now echoed only in memory. The campaigns that had swept people into collective storms left behind depleted fields, factories operating at a crawl, and millions of individuals who longed for just one simple thing: a peaceful life. It was a moment when revolution no longer needed more shouts. It needed someone calm enough to bend down, gather the scattered fragments, and rearrange life so that society could continue to endure itself. The man who stepped forward at that moment did not resemble a prophet. He did not come to promise a new paradise. He arrived only after the storm, like someone who cleans up. His name was Deng Xiaoping. In tonight's video from Deep Sleep of Power, we will not tell this story as an epic of heroes. We will tell it slowly, like a historical lullaby, about a man who understood that power does not have to be dazzling, and that sometimes the greatest strength lies in making things work. Deng Xiaoping did not replace the revolution with another ideal. He replaced it with reality. If you are listening now as the room has grown quiet, let this story accompany the slowing rhythm of your breath. And if you find value in the way we tell history at night, please consider supporting the Deep Sleep of Power channel with a like, a small subscription, or a comment suggesting the figures and themes you would like to hear about in the nights to come. Because from here, as we move into the next part, the story will open onto a more important question. Between Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, how did they believe in history in two profoundly different ways? And how did that very difference change the course of a vessel called China? After the storm of the revolutionary years had subsided, Chinese history entered a rare pause. Not a state of complete peace, but the deep exhaustion of a society that had gone too far in its own faith. It was within this pause that two names emerged as two fundamentally different ways of understanding history: Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. They differed not only in personality and leadership style, but more importantly, in how they believed in history, beliefs that were almost diametrically opposed. For Mao Zedong, history was a current that could be bent by sheer will. He believed that if faith was strong enough, if the masses were mobilized on a sufficiently vast scale, reality itself would have to yield. In Mao's worldview, human beings were not merely victims of circumstance, but instruments to propel history forward in great leaps. Poverty could be erased through a revolutionary spirit. Backwardness could be overcome with slogans. Mistakes, if they occurred at all, were merely temporary costs, paid for a future that was inevitably better. History, in Mao's eyes, was a process that needed to be driven forward, even through pain. That belief was not without power. It forged a new China from the ashes of war and division. It gave millions of people the feeling for the first time that they stood at the very center of history. Yet within that belief lay a dangerous seed. When history is treated as a sacred mission, the concrete human being, with fear, exhaustion, and limits, becomes secondary. In Mao's world, history mattered more than life itself. Deng Xiaoping emerged from that very world, but he saw something different. For Deng, history was not a machine that could be forced to accelerate endlessly. It resembled a living body. Push it too fast, and it would collapse. Stretch it too far, and it would break. Deng did not deny the role of ideals, but he deeply questioned their ability to replace reality. He did not believe a society could survive for long in a state of constant tension. For him, the crucial question was not, where should history go, but How much can society still endure? This difference did not reveal itself through public ideological confrontation. Deng Xiaoping was not the type to engage in direct intellectual combat. He understood very well the symbolic weight of Mao, and he also understood that smashing that symbol could bring down the entire system. And so, Deng chose a quieter, more cautious path. Not denying Mao, but no longer believing as Mao had believed. If Mao saw history as a horse that needed to be whipped forward, Deng viewed history as a long road, where what mattered most was not collapsing halfway along the way. Deng's famous saying, "It doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice," is often quoted as a symbol of pragmatism. But if we listen to it in the stillness of the night, we hear that it is more than an economic philosophy. It is a quiet declaration of how he understood history itself. In an ideological system accustomed to dividing the world into absolute right and wrong, Deng introduced another criterion: effectiveness in real human life. And it was precisely this criterion that began to loosen the foundations of a belief once considered untouchable. Mao believed history required leaps. Deng believed history needed to be repaired step by step. Mao was willing to accept chaos in order to reach an ideal future. Deng feared prolonged chaos above all else, having witnessed firsthand the price society paid when all limits were ignored. If Mao represented an era of absolute faith, Deng was the product of lucidity after that faith, a lucidity that was not glamorous but enduring. Notably, Deng never placed himself in a position of moral opposition to Mao. He did not say Mao was wrong, nor did he claim himself to be right. He did something simpler, yet far more difficult. He changed the way history operated without changing its language. The slogans remained, but behind them, decisions were increasingly measured by concrete results. It was this very quietness that made Deng's influence deeper and harder to perceive. In retrospect, Mao and Deng appear like two different breaths of the same historical body. Mao was the rapid breathing of youth, full of fervor and ready to trade everything away. Deng was the slow breathing of a society that had endured too much damage and longed only for stability in order to heal. One believed history had to be forced in order to give birth to the new. The other believed history truly changes only when human beings still have the strength to keep going. And perhaps it is within this difference that we begin to understand why Deng Xiaoping does not appear as a dazzling hero in collective memory. He did not create a moment of explosion. He created a long, slow, and deeply contradictory process, but one realistic enough to survive. And so, as we move into the next part of the story, we will travel far back in time to Deng's early years to explore a more fundamental question. What shaped a child from Sichuan, one who did not believe in gods or destiny, into a man with such a lucid, almost cold, understanding of history and power? There are certain sentences that, when removed from their context, sound like simple jokes. Yet when placed back into their proper historical moment, we begin to understand why they were powerful enough to shake an entire ideology. Deng Xiaoping's remark, "It doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice," is one such sentence. It did not erupt amid cheers. It was not written as a manifesto. It appeared quietly, almost by chance, within a society that had grown accustomed for decades to absolute answers about right and wrong. To understand why this sentence was dangerous, we must recall what kind of mental landscape China occupied at that time. Throughout the Mao Zedong era, the world was sharply divided, right or wrong, revolutionary or counter-revolutionary, progressive or backward. Every choice carried a moral weight. A policy was judged not only by its outcomes, but by how correct it was ideologically. And within such an order, asking whether something was effective could itself be seen as an act of betrayal. Deng Xiaoping did not enter this debate with lofty theory. He did not write a new book, nor did he construct a rival system of concepts. He offered only an image drawn from everyday life, a cat, not to diminish ideals, but to bring thinking back down to the ground. When people are hungry, when production stalls, when society is exhausted, the question is no longer whether the cat has the right color. The only question that still matters is whether it helps us go on living. It is precisely here that Deng's remark became a true heresy, for it did not attack the old ideology head-on, but did something far more dangerous. It changed the criterion by which reality was judged. From asking, "Is this right or wrong in theory?" Deng quietly shifted the question to, "Does this help people live better?" What seemed like a small adjustment carried the potential to collapse an entire castle of belief built upon the purity of ideology. Notably, Deng never presented this sentence as a universal truth. He did not demand that others believe in it. He used it merely as a way of speaking, a suggestive mode of thought. In the tense political climate of China, this ambiguity became its protective shell. The sentence was not sharp enough to be condemned, yet deep enough to seep gradually into the way decisions were made. And once it had seeped in, it began to do its work, weakening faith in absolute answers. For Mao, a mistaken policy could be justified if it served a greater ideal. For Deng, a policy that failed to produce results, no matter how noble the ideal behind it, was a burden society could not carry for long. This difference was not a betrayal of revolution, but a natural response from someone who had witnessed too many consequences of treating human beings as means. Deng did not deny the value of goals, but he understood that any goal becomes meaningless if the path toward it continually crushes everyday life. In the slow cadence of the night, the phrase, "black cat" or "white cat" feels less like a declaration and more like a sigh. It carries none of the pride of a victor, but rather the lucidity of someone who has lived through too many failures. Deng no longer believed that history required spectacular leaps forward. He believed history needed small adjustments, just enough to keep society from further injuring itself. For this reason, the sentence did more than open the door to economic reform. It opened the door to a new attitude toward power itself. Power was no longer measured by the ability to generate grand movements, but by the capacity to keep society functioning steadily. In Deng's world, a good decision was one that caused the least disruption while bringing about real improvement. This notion was deeply alien to revolutionary logic, yet profoundly aligned with the needs of a weary society. It can be said that black cat or white cat marked the moment Deng Xiaoping laid the foundation for an entirely different mode of thinking. Experimental thinking. No more absolute promises. No more single correct paths. Only cautious steps. Steps that could be adjusted, reversed if they proved wrong. And within that very humility, Deng's power became more enduring than any rallying cry. Yet to utter such a sentence, Deng needed more than intelligence. He needed a life long enough to understand the limits of belief. The sentence was not born in a conference room, but from a life that had passed through poverty, war, purges, and silence. It was the distillation of a man no longer searching for absolute correctness, but for a way of existence that inflicted less pain upon society. And as the story pauses here, we begin to see that Deng's pragmatism did not suddenly appear when he came to power. It had been formed much earlier, during his earliest years in the life of a boy who grew up in hardship, who did not believe in gods or destiny, but only in what could be touched and changed. To understand the roots of that lucidity more clearly, we will now turn back time, leaving behind the halls of power and returning to Sichuan and Paris, where the journey of Deng Xiaoping truly began. If Deng Xiaoping's pragmatic way of thinking did not originate in the halls of power, then its roots lay much deeper in his earliest memories of poverty. Before becoming one of the figures who shaped China's future, Deng was simply a boy in Sichuan, where life was not framed by grand concepts, but by very small questions. Was there enough to eat today? What would tomorrow bring? Poverty here did not appear heroic or romantic. It was quiet, persistent, and it taught its first lesson early on. Life does not operate according to ideals. What mattered was that Deng did not grow up with a sense of humiliation so crushing that it demanded revenge against the world, as was the case for many other revolutionaries. His family was not wealthy, but neither was it ground down to the point where poverty turned into hatred. That just harsh enough condition produced a different mindset, not the dream of saving humanity, but the hope of finding a practical way out of deprivation. From a very early age, Deng's motivation was not to rewrite history, but to change the concrete conditions of human life. When Deng left China for France, during the work-study movement of the early 20th century, he did not carry with him a fully formed, revolutionary dream. Paris did not present itself to him as an ideological paradise, but as a very real shock. There, Deng worked as a laborer, lived in cramped housing, and confronted the cold discipline of assembly lines and industrial routines. The West was not viewed through admiration, but through sober observation. This society functioned not because of speeches, but because of systems, processes, and discipline repeated day after day. It was in this context that Marxism came to Deng not as a new religion. He did not sanctify it, nor did he treat it as a final truth. For Deng, Marx was a tool for understanding how the world actually worked, not a promise of paradise. Years later, Deng would articulate this outlook in a phrase that became emblematic of his thinking: "Seek truth from facts." This was not a rhetorical slogan, but an attitude toward life forged during years of labor in a foreign land, where every theory had to answer one very concrete question: does it help people survive? Paris taught Deng a lesson he never forgot. Modernity does not equal justice, but modernity is inseparable from efficiency. He saw exploitation, but he also saw productivity. He saw injustice, but he also saw the capacity to organize society on a large scale. Seeing both sides at once helped Deng avoid the most dangerous temptation faced by many young revolutionaries: the belief that destruction alone is enough. For him, destruction was only the beginning. The harder question always came afterwards: how to rebuild without recreating poverty. When Deng returned to China, he brought back not a complete doctrine, but a way of thinking. He did not enter the party as a prophet bearing truth, but as a cadre willing to do the unnoticed work. While many sought positions as voices of ideology, Deng accepted organizational roles. While others were intoxicated by revolutionary language, he focused on making the machinery function. This humility did not stem from a lack of ambition, but from an early understanding. Enduring power lies not in words, but in the ability to solve concrete problems. Looking back at the journey from Sichuan to Paris, we can trace a continuous thread. Poverty taught Deng the limits of ideals, while modernity taught him the limits of emotion. Together, they led him to a quiet yet profound conclusion. There is no quick path to social salvation. All change must pass through small, unglamorous things: production, organization, discipline, and patience. That is why, while many revolutionaries of his generation believed they were entering history to accomplish greatness, Deng viewed history as a long-term equation, where every mistake carried an enormous cost. This also explains why Deng was never drawn to the image of the hero. He did not believe in moments of sudden enlightenment. He believed in the slow accumulation of experience. Later, at the height of power, Deng would say, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." But the seeds of that sentence had been planted much earlier, in the days when he understood that any doctrine, no matter how elegant, is meaningless if it does not reach the hunger in a human stomach. And from this foundation, we can understand why Deng Xiaoping never fully surrendered to revolutionary fervor. He entered it, worked within it, but always maintained a sober distance. That distance would grow wider as he confronted war, power, and the brutal limits of ideals on the battlefield of reality. To see this transformation more clearly, in the next part, we will follow Deng through the years of resistance against Japan, where he learned an even harsher lesson. When ideals collide with survival, reality always takes precedence. If poverty in Sichuan taught Deng Xiaoping about the limits of ideals, then France taught him another lesson: the limits of romanticism. Paris did not welcome Deng with glittering boulevards or intellectual salons, as imagined by many young Easterners in the early 20th century. He entered France through the narrow doorway of working-class life. Noisy factories, meager wages, and a rhythm of life so repetitive it felt cold. Here, modernity was not a dream, but a machine. The greatest shock for Deng lay not in wealth or poverty, but in the way society functioned. France did not require slogans to survive from day to day. Everything was kept running through discipline, procedures, and each individual accepting a small role within a larger system. Deng saw injustice, but he also saw an undeniable truth. This system generated wealth steadily, independent of fleeting inspiration or belief. For the first time, he encountered a society in which efficiency mattered more than emotion. Marxism reached Deng in this context, not as a sacred flame, but as a set of analytical tools. He read and debated, but he did not worship. Marx helped him name the contradictions of industrial society, yet did not persuade him that overthrow alone was enough. On the contrary, witnessing the functioning of the West led Deng to understand that destroying a system is easy. Building one capable of sustaining millions of people every day is the real challenge. In Paris, Deng learned how to observe without rushing to judgment. He saw the exploitation of capitalism, but he also saw its superior capacity to organize production. He saw class divisions, but he also saw a society able to anticipate tomorrow, something China at that time sorely lacked. This ability to hold two sides in view at once set Deng apart from many revolutionaries of his generation, who tended either to believe completely or to reject completely. Deng did neither. He retained what could be used and discarded the rest. There is a detail rarely mentioned, yet deeply significant. Deng never tried to become French, nor did he carry a sense of inferiority toward the West. He observed with the distance of someone who came to learn, not to worship. This attitude spared him from the greatest temptation of the modern shock: the belief that all answers lay elsewhere. For Deng, modernity was something that had to be translated into China's circumstances, not copied wholesale. The years of labor and study in France also honed in Deng a distinctive quality: practical silence. While many were intoxicated by debates over how to save the nation, Deng spent his time watching how machines worked, how labor was organized, how a factory maintained a steady rhythm. He learned that a good system does not need to shout every day. It simply needs to keep operating. Later, when he stood behind major reforms, this quality would become the clearest hallmark of his leadership style. Paris also taught Deng about the limits of political emotion. He witnessed movements and heated debates within overseas Chinese communities, but he also saw how easily they dissolved when confronted with everyday life. This experience deepened his skepticism toward grand promises, unaccompanied by organizational capacity. He did not lose faith in social change, but he lost faith in shortcuts. Looking back, we can say that France did not turn Deng Xiaoping into a westernized thinker. It made him someone who understood modernity through direct experience. Modernity, in Deng's eyes, was not abstract freedom or moral progress, but the ability to sustain a complex society without collapse. This was the quiet yet profound lesson Paris left behind. For this reason, when Deng returned to China, he carried a very different kind of baggage from many other revolutionaries. He did not bring back an ideal blueprint. He brought back a haunting question: how could a populous, impoverished, and deeply wounded society first achieve stable operation before speaking of greater dreams? That question would follow him throughout his life, gradually shaping every political choice he would later make. Yet the shock of modernity was not the harshest test. The lessons learned in the factories and streets of Paris would soon be placed in a far more brutal context: war. When Deng entered the years of resistance against Japan, he would be forced to confront the naked truth that under conditions of survival, not every system has the chance to be perfected, and not every ideal has the time to wait. It would be there that his practical way of thinking would be tested to its very limits. When Deng Xiaoping left France and returned to China, he did not carry the aura of a Western-educated intellectual, nor did he come back as a hero who had discovered a redemptive truth. His baggage was far simpler: years of labor, quiet observations of how societies actually function, and a rare sobriety toward grand promises. Returning to his homeland at a time when revolution was surging, Deng entered history not with the sound of drums, but through a very modest position, that of an organizational cadre. China at that moment did not lack eloquent speakers. What it lacked were people who could make the machinery work under harsh realities. Deng grasped this quickly. He did not seek the role of a spokesperson, nor did he try to become the public face of an ideal. Instead, he chose to stand behind the scenes, where the driest work took place, organizing, coordinating, allocating resources, maintaining discipline. These were tasks few paid attention to, yet without them, every slogan became meaningless. This choice set Deng apart from the very beginning. While many of his contemporaries treated politics as a stage on which to perform belief, Deng viewed it as a problem of operation. He did not first ask, "Is this correct ideologically?" but rather, "Will this actually work?" At that time, this question was not openly rebellious, but it made him an unusual figure, someone not swept away by revolutionary romanticism, yet not standing outside the revolution either. Here, the implicit contrast with Mao Zedong began to grow clearer. Mao needed the stage. He understood the power of symbols, of discourse, of igniting collective belief. Deng was the opposite. He accepted the backstage. He felt no need to become the emotional center of the masses. For Deng, power did not lie in being seen, but in keeping the system from collapsing. Two men, two modes of presence in history, one under the spotlight, the other in the shadows. This lack of glamour was not the result of moral modesty, but a conscious choice. Deng had seen in France and in his early years back in China that complex systems cannot operate on sustained emotion alone. They require people willing to work in silence, to accept decisions that bring no immediate admiration. Deng was such a person. He understood that if everyone wanted to be a prophet, there would be no one patient enough to be the mechanic. This also explains why Deng never sought to construct a dazzling personal image. He did not tell stories about himself, nor did he cultivate myth. Even when holding important positions, he appeared as part of the machinery, not as its soul. For him, the more indistinct the individual, the greater the system's chance of long-term survival. This was a conception of power fundamentally different from the familiar revolutionary logic. In a political environment marked by competition and suspicion, choosing to stand behind the scenes was also a strategy of survival. Deng did not confront figures with greater charisma head-on. He did not compete for symbolic roles. He let others lead emotions while he focused on structure. Because of this, he survived, advanced step by step, and accumulated influence in ways that were difficult to perceive. Deng's power, from the very beginning, bore the mark of endurance rather than eruption. Yet this silence did not mean blind obedience. Deng observed the limits of revolution closely once it entered real operation. He saw the gap between slogans and everyday life. He saw people grow weary when required to live in a constant state of tension. These observations were not spoken aloud, but they accumulated, gradually forming an attitude. Revolution cannot be a permanent condition of society. At some point, society needs to breathe. It was at this stage that Deng began to resemble a manager among missionaries. He did not deny the spiritual value of revolution, but he questioned its capacity to organize long-term life. For him, belief mattered only when it could be translated into concrete improvements. Otherwise, belief became a burden. This conclusion was drawn not from books, but from the direct experience of someone who had lived through both poverty and modernity. Looking back, being an unglamorous cadre was not a marginal phase in Deng Xiaoping's life. It was the psychological foundation for his entire later historical role. Precisely because he was accustomed to working in the shadows, he could reform without overthrowing symbols. Precisely because he was not obsessed with personal image, he could place the system above reputation. And precisely because he deeply understood the value of making things work, he became the person suited to repairing a society that had gone too far in believing in itself. As the story continues to unfold, these qualities will soon be tested under far harsher conditions. War does not allow prolonged theoretical calculations. It forces people to confront the limits of ideals and the endurance of society directly. In the next part, as Deng enters the years of resistance against Japan, this practical way of thinking will no longer be a personal choice. It will become a condition of survival. War, unlike revolution, does not allow human beings to dwell for long in a world of beautiful concepts. When Deng Xiaoping entered the years of resistance against Japan, everything he had observed, questioned, and kept in silence was placed before a ruthless question. When life is threatened every day, where do ideals stand? This was no longer a matter of discourse or belief, but a matter of survival, of individuals, of organizations, and of an entire society being eroded by prolonged war. In this context, war did not appear as a stage for heroic epics, but as a continuous series of tests on human endurance. The War of Resistance did not operate on polished slogans. It ran on scarce food, improvised logistics, and decisions made under conditions of incomplete information. Deng, in his role as an organizer and manager, quickly grasped a cold truth. Those who survive are not always those who believe most fervently, but those who adjust most quickly. Revolutionary ideals remained an important source of motivation in wartime, but Deng saw their limits with clarity. Belief could help people rise in a moment, but it could not feed them for months, for years. A unit with high morale but poor organization would disintegrate faster than a disciplined unit with fewer rallying cries. In this sense, war became an uncompromising test of all abstract thinking. It forced ideals to prove their worth through concrete results or disappear. Deng did not enter the war as a theorist. He entered it as someone dealing with very real numbers. How much grain remained, how many people could be moved, how long resources could be sustained. Here, the sobriety forged in France and in his years as a backstage cadre proved its value. He understood that a wrong decision, even if born of noble intentions, could cost hundreds of lives. And in war, there is no time to correct mistakes with speeches. It was under these conditions that Deng learned his most important lesson about the limits of ideals. Ideals were not useless, but they were not enough. They had to be anchored in reality, in organizational capacity, in an understanding of human psychology under extreme conditions. When hungry, exhausted, and afraid, people no longer respond as they do in books. Deng observed this not with disappointment, but with acceptance. He did not blame people for failing to be revolutionary enough. He understood that it was the circumstances that needed to be managed. War also stripped away a dangerous illusion, the belief that willpower could compensate for every deficiency. In reality, willpower cannot replace logistics, cannot replace organization, cannot replace long-term planning. Defeats did not come from a lack of courage, but from a lack of sustainability. From this, Deng drew a quiet yet profound conclusion. A system that relies solely on spirit will consume itself. This became even clearer as the war dragged on. The initial fervor gradually gave way to exhaustion. Deng witnessed how people adapted, compromised, and sometimes gave up. Yet rather than seeing this as moral decay, he treated it as empirical data. For him, the task of leadership was not to condemn people for insufficient ideals, but to build conditions in which people would not be forced to live perpetually in a state of depletion. Here we see a subtle but crucial difference between Deng and many revolutionaries of his time. While some regarded war as a trial meant to purify the spirit, Deng saw it as a warning about the limits of social endurance. He did not romanticize suffering. He did not believe suffering, by itself, would produce something good. If suffering is not managed, it merely accumulates and explodes in unpredictable ways. War, in Deng's eyes, was the most vivid proof of this truth. The years of resistance also taught Deng the value of flexibility. No plan survives intact when confronted with battlefield reality. Those who are rigid, even if unwaveringly loyal to ideals, are often the first to be placed in danger. Deng learned to adjust, to change, and to accept imperfect solutions. For him, perfection existed only on paper. In life, what mattered was avoiding irreversible mistakes. When the war ended, Deng emerged not with the glory of a general, but with a reservoir of silent experience. He had seen history in its most naked form, where every belief must confront its cost. This experience made him increasingly cautious toward calls for unlimited mobilization. He understood that society, like the human body, has a threshold of endurance. Once that threshold is crossed, any ideal can become a burden. And because he learned this lesson amid the smoke of war, Deng entered the next stage of his life with a very different strategy. Instead of seeking to shine, he chose to exist in the shadow of larger figures, observing, accumulating, and waiting for the right moment. In the next part, as Mao Zedong rises like the sun of the Chinese Revolution, we will see Deng Xiaoping choose a very different position, not to confront, not to challenge, but to learn how to live and work within a system designed by someone else. When the war ended, China did not immediately enter a period of calm. Instead, it moved into another phase, a phase of concentrated light. Mao Zedong rose like the sun of the revolution, not only a political leader, but a spiritual symbol, an emotional center, and a moral reference point for a nation newly reborn from ruins. Under such intense light, everything was illuminated, and precisely for that reason, everything was also obscured by the glare itself. Deng Xiaoping existed in this period as a distinctive silhouette. He did not stand outside Mao's light, yet he did not step directly into its center either. Deng remained in the shadow, not the darkness of opposition, but the shade cast by the system itself. From there, he observed how power functioned when it was elevated into absolute belief. He saw the mobilizing force of symbols, but he also saw the price society paid when those symbols left no room for doubt. Mao understood his role very clearly. He believed that history required a strong moral axis, a collective will tightly concentrated. In Mao's world, ambiguity was dangerous, and hesitation was betrayal. History had to be led, had to be driven forward by an undivided faith. Deng, by contrast, perceived in that very concentration a long-term risk. He did not openly oppose Mao, for he understood that confronting a symbol was political suicide. But neither did he dissolve himself into that symbol. He chose instead to exist, quietly, patiently, and with great clarity. In Mao's shadow, Deng learned a crucial lesson about power. Symbolic power has immense mobilizing force, but it also paralyzes a system's ability to self-correct. When every decision is illuminated by the aura of a single individual, mistakes are no longer named. They are legitimized, wrapped in belief, and therefore prolonged beyond what society can endure. Deng did not articulate this aloud. He remembered it. Deng's wisdom in this period lay not in what he did, but in what he refrained from doing. He did not engage Mao in philosophical debate. He did not build an opposing faction. He did not attempt to become a second Mao. Instead, he continued to take on roles few desired: management, organization, coordination, tasks that demanded patience and acceptance of invisibility. While the spotlight shone on grand speeches, Deng remained behind the scenes, keeping the machinery from descending into chaos. This position allowed Deng to see more clearly the cracks that were forming. He saw the tension between slogans and everyday life. He saw people growing exhausted when asked to live in a permanent state of revolution. Yet, unlike many others, Deng did not conclude that revolution itself was wrong. He simply recognized that revolution could not be a permanent condition of society. A society cannot breathe if every moment is elevated into a historical mission. In Mao's shadow, Deng also learned restraint. He understood that speaking at the right time mattered as much as speaking the right truth. Some truths, if spoken too early, only provoke defensive reactions. And so Deng chose to accumulate influence rather than display opinion. He allowed reality itself to reveal its limits. When campaigns went too far, when society grew weary, when numbers no longer aligned with lived experience, this was when his way of thinking gradually became necessary, even if it was not yet named. Existing in the shade was not easy. It demanded considerable psychological endurance, accepting being misunderstood as lacking zeal, accepting the absence of recognition, and accepting that others would receive the glory. But Deng had been accustomed to this from an early age. For him, power was not about being seen, but about the ability to shape how a system operates over time. And to do that, one sometimes has to remain outside the field of vision. Mao represented an era that required absolute belief in order to survive and unify. Deng represented a different rhythm, a rhythm of adjustment after unity had been achieved. These two men differed not only in temperament, but in the historical moments they served. Yet during Mao's peak years, history was not ready for adjustment, and Deng understood this. He waited. He waited not out of fear, but out of an understanding that history has its own tempo. One cannot force sobriety upon a society that still needs belief to stand upright. In Mao's shadow, Deng did not try to alter that rhythm. He merely ensured that when society began to tire, when belief started to become a burden, another way of thinking would be ready to emerge. In retrospect, the period in Mao's shadow did not make Deng smaller. It made him deeper. He learned to distinguish between power that excites and power that sustains. He understood that light too intense can blind, while shade, if cool enough, can keep people clear-headed. That clarity would become his most valuable asset in the years to come, as the tension between managerial thinking and missionary thinking grew increasingly visible. And that was also the moment when Deng was no longer merely a man standing in the shadows. As the missionaries continued to speak of belief and mission, China would increasingly need those who could answer a simpler, yet far more difficult question: how to keep things running. In the next part, we will see Deng Xiaoping step more clearly into that role, a manager among missionaries, where ideological conflict was no longer silent, but began to take form in the realities of governance itself. When the light of belief envelops the entire political space, those who stand in the middle of the system are often viewed with suspicion. They do not speak words that shake the heart. They do not promise a radiant future, and they do not carry the aura of the chosen. Deng Xiaoping in those years was precisely such a person, a manager among missionaries. Around him were people who believed deeply in the power of slogans, mass mobilization, and ideological purity. For them, revolution was not merely a means, but a moral state that had to be sustained. Every decision had to demonstrate loyalty to the ideal. Every doubt could be seen as a sign of deviation. In such an environment, Deng did not present himself as an opponent, but neither did he fully merge into it. He chose a more uncomfortable position, the one who asked how things actually functioned, even when such questions were unwelcome. Deng did not deny the spiritual value of revolution. He understood that collective belief had helped China endure war and chaos. But he also saw an increasingly evident truth. Belief, when not anchored in reality, can become a burden. In meetings and organizational decisions, Deng always returned to very concrete matters. Was production increasing? Was food sufficient? Could people still endure this pace? These questions sounded mundane, but precisely for that reason, they became dangerous in a context where lofty ideals were always given priority. This is where the difference between a manager and a missionary becomes clear. The missionary sees history as a moral journey that must be guided. The manager sees history as a series of problems that must be solved. The missionary believes that if the goal is righteous enough, people will adapt. The manager believes the opposite. If people cannot adapt, the goal will collapse. Deng stood firmly on the latter logic, fully aware that it would never earn admiration. In his roles of organization and coordination, Deng gradually perceived a growing contradiction. The more slogans were issued, and the more energy was mobilized, the harder it became for the system to correct itself when mistakes occurred. Every failure was explained as a lack of enthusiasm, rather than a flaw in design. Every warning was labeled pessimism. Deng did not openly refute this, but he noted it as a dangerous pattern. When ideology becomes the sole yardstick, reality is bent to fit it. Here, Deng's way of thinking, making things work, began to show itself more clearly. He did not try to change political language, but rather the way decisions were made. Instead of asking whether a policy was revolutionary enough, he asked how long it could be sustained. Instead of praising sacrifice, he sought to reduce the need for sacrifice. For Deng, a good system was not one that demanded heroism from people every day, but one that allowed people to live ordinary lives while society continued to move forward. This made him a somewhat
June 22nd, 1941, 3:15 a.m., the German-Soviet border, Oberst Heinrich Eberbach stood in the commander's hatch of his Panzer III, watching the eastern horizon. The 4th Panzer Division stretched behind him in the pre-dawn darkness, 17,000 men and 300 tanks arranged in assault formation across the Polish plains. The veteran tank commander had fought through Poland, France, and the Balkans. He had never seen anything like this. To his north and south, across a front stretching 1,800 miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, 3 million German soldiers waited in absolute silence. Behind them, 600,000 vehicles, 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft. The largest invasion force ever assembled in human history, all pointed at one target, the Soviet Union. At precisely 3:15 a.m., German artillery erupted across the entire front. Eberbach would later write in his memoir that the bombardment lit the sky like artificial dawn. Minutes later, he gave the order his crews had been waiting for. Panzer, marsch! The German army surged across the border. The Luftwaffe struck Soviet airfields, destroying over 1,200 aircraft in the first day, most caught on the ground. Soviet border guards, stunned by the violation of the Nazi-Soviet pact, died at their posts, still trying to understand what was happening. Operation Barbarossa had begun. Within 6 months, German forces would advance 600 miles into Soviet territory. They would capture 3.8 million Soviet soldiers. They would reach the suburbs of Moscow, close enough to see the Kremlin spires through binoculars. German reconnaissance units would penetrate to within 14 miles of the Soviet capital, and then, through a series of decisions that military historians still debate, Adolf Hitler would lose the war. This is the story of how the largest military operation in history succeeded beyond all expectation, then failed, because the man who launched it couldn't decide which city to destroy first, how 3 critical months wasted on a detour would cost Germany everything, how 14 miles became the difference between Nazi victory and total destruction.
The Great Leap Forward, when retold in textbooks, often appears as a macro-level policy failure. But for those inside the system, it did not begin as a catastrophe. It began with belief. The belief that history could be accelerated, that collective will could shorten a path other societies had taken centuries to walk. And it was precisely in this period that Deng Xiaoping occupied a very particular position, neither the loudest advocate nor the most outspoken opponent, but the one who witnessed reality begin to slide away from the very first numbers. From within the machinery, Deng saw how the Great Leap Forward was built upon a familiar logic. If the goal was grand enough, people would overcome their limits. Reports of soaring output proliferated. Confident assertions about surpassing Britain and catching up with America spread through every level. In such an atmosphere, doubt became untimely. Anyone who questioned the feasibility risked being labeled as lacking faith. And so, numbers began to replace reality. Deng was not someone who underestimated the power of belief. He had seen it in war, in revolution, in moments when people overcame fear. But he also understood something else. Belief cannot produce grain out of emptiness, cannot sustain production when fundamental links are ignored. From the inside, he saw reports grow ever more impressive, while real life became increasingly strained. The gap was not loud, but it widened day by day. What made the Great Leap Forward dangerous was not only its unrealistic goals, but the mechanism of collective self-deception. Once a figure was reported to please superiors, it generated a cascade of other figures designed to protect it. Truth was bent not out of personal malice, but out of fear of being left outside the current of shared belief. Deng observed this chain reaction with cold clarity. He did not oppose it openly, not because he believed in it, but because he understood that opposition at that moment amounted to removing oneself from the system altogether. The difference between Mao and Deng during this period became sharper than ever. Mao needed to believe in the Great Leap Forward because that belief underpinned the historical role he carried. Admitting error would not merely mean adjusting policy. It would shake the entire symbol. Deng, by contrast, had no need to defend a salvational image. He saw consequences forming and recorded them as a lesson never to be forgotten. When a system rewards belief more than truth, catastrophe becomes only a matter of time. In those years, Deng learned a bitter lesson about power. Power does not reside only in final decisions, but in how information is filtered upward. When truth is distorted at every layer, the person at the top no longer touches reality. And at that point, every decision, no matter how well-intentioned, becomes blind. Deng did not need more books to understand this. He saw it daily, in meetings, in reports, and in the growing weight of silence among those who understood what was happening. Notably, Deng did not fall into moral outrage. He did not condemn individuals. He understood that the system had produced these behaviors, and for that reason, his response was not to seek out the guilty, but to find ways to prevent the mechanism from repeating itself. In Deng's eyes, the Great Leap Forward was not merely a policy mistake, but a warning about the limits of unlimited mobilization. No society can endure indefinitely in a state of maximized tension. As the consequences became undeniable, famine, disorder, collapse, Deng absorbed another painful truth. Ideals, when not checked by reality, transform themselves into violence. Not the violence of guns, but the violence of prolonged wrong decisions. In such violence, The victims have no specific enemy to fight. They can only endure. That silent endurance left a deep imprint on how Deng would later view power. The Great Leap Forward ended not with a clear confession, but with the exhaustion of society. For Deng, it was the moment when an old intuition was confirmed. History cannot be forced into limitless acceleration. Every attempt to push beyond the material and psychological limits of human beings exacts a price. And that price, sooner or later, returns to those who made the decisions. When Deng emerged from this period, he did not appear as a victor in debate. He appeared as someone who had carefully memorized a lesson for which history had paid tuition in lives and suffering. That lesson would follow him for the rest of his life. Doubt numbers that look too good. Be wary of promises that come too fast, and always ask how much society can still endure. But if the Great Leap Forward was a lesson in collective error, the next trial would be far more severe. In the Cultural Revolution, it was not only policies that were put on trial, but human beings themselves. In the next part, we will see Deng Xiaoping no longer merely as a witness to the consequences of blind belief. He would become a direct victim of a revolution turning back upon those who had helped create it. The Cultural Revolution did not begin as a personal purge. It began as a reaffirmation of belief. After the Great Leap Forward, when reality no longer aligned with promises, Chinese history entered a dangerous moment. Instead of adjusting the system, it sought to cleanse people. Within this logic, error was no longer a matter of policy, but a sign of ideological deviation. And when ideology is placed above life itself, survival can become a crime. Deng Xiaoping entered the Cultural Revolution not as an open enemy of Mao, but as a suspicious figure. He did not shout loudly enough, did not display sufficient fervor, did not dissolve himself completely into the whirlwind of collective emotion. In a society where fanaticism was treated as proof of loyalty, sobriety became dangerous. And so Deng was pushed to the margins, not because he had done something explicitly wrong, but because he did not resemble what was expected. The Cultural Revolution completely inverted the logic of life. Experience accumulated over many years became evidence of guilt. Those who had worked within the system were labeled as embodiments of the capitalist road. Managerial competence, instead of being valued, was seen as a threat. In this world, long survival within the machinery no longer signified contribution, but contamination. Deng, with everything he represented, caution, realism, effectiveness, became a natural target. Yet what made the Cultural Revolution most ruthless was not its grand slogans, but its intrusion into private life. Deng not only lost his position, he lost his dignity, his right to silence. His family was dragged into the vortex of judgment. His son was permanently injured, a wound not only to the body, but to the memory of the entire family. This was no longer an abstract ideological struggle. It was the crushing of human beings by a belief that accepted no limits. In such circumstances, many chose one of two responses, either lifelong resentment or the transformation of suffering into a new, salvational mission. Deng did neither. What stands out most about him in this period is not what he said, but what he did not become. He did not turn himself into a martyr. He did not accumulate hatred in anticipation of revenge. He chose a far more difficult path, survival without turning pain into a political identity. Survival during the Cultural Revolution was a fragile condition. It demanded silence, endurance, and the willingness to accept being erased from history for a long time. Deng accepted this, not because he surrendered, but because he understood a bitter truth. When a system has decided to punish, open resistance only prolongs suffering. His withdrawal was not an act of forgetting, but of remembering. During the years of marginalization, Deng observed society from a different position, the position of a victim. He saw how people were forced to deny themselves in order to survive. He saw relationships shattered, beliefs coerced, confessions produced as rituals of endurance. From this he drew a cold yet profound conclusion. Ideology, when granted absolute punitive power, does not stop at correcting errors. It seeks to control memory and humanity itself. This left an indelible mark on Deng's understanding of power. He no longer believed that any ideology, no matter how well-intentioned, could be immune to abuse. He understood that power must be constrained not only by rules, but by lived reality. Otherwise, it will turn back and punish those who once served it. For Deng, the Cultural Revolution was not merely a personal tragedy. It was the final proof that society cannot endure a permanent state of moral judgment. When the Cultural Revolution gradually subsided, what remained was not a clear victory, but the deep exhaustion of an entire nation. Deng emerged from this period not with glory, but with a rare form of understanding. Suffering does not automatically produce wisdom, but if remembered in the right way, it can prevent history from repeating its most brutal mistakes. He spoke little about what had happened. He allowed it to settle, like a scar that need not be displayed but always reminds. Precisely because he did not turn himself into a symbol of pain, Deng preserved a necessary distance from the past. That distance allowed him to think not about revenge, but about how to ensure that society would never have to pass through another cultural revolution. It was a practical question, not a salvational one, but it demanded a steadier courage than any call to arms. In the next part, as we move into surviving without becoming a saint, the story will no longer focus on what Deng lost, but on something more important, what he managed to retain after all that crushing, and why it was precisely this refusal to become sanctified that made him capable of repairing history, rather than continuing to wound it. After the Cultural Revolution, history often expects survivors to assume a familiar role, to become symbols, to become moral witnesses, to become those who endured in order to speak for the pain of an era. But Deng Xiaoping did not step into that role. He survived without becoming sanctified, and it was precisely this refusal of sanctification that most profoundly shaped how he viewed power, history, and human beings. For many, suffering becomes the raw material of a mission. Having been purged, humiliated, and wounded, they discover in memory a new kind of authority, the authority of those who have endured. Deng did not take that path. He did not turn pain into a political identity. He did not treat his survival as moral proof that history owed him compensation. Instead, he faced a more uncomfortable truth. Suffering does not automatically make people more righteous. It was precisely his experience of being crushed by a system once regarded as just that made Deng wary of all forms of salvation. He understood that when a person believes they represent collective pain, they are easily tempted to grant themselves permissions denied to others. In this way, sanctification, even when born of tragedy, opens the door to a new cycle of violence. Deng refused to become the next link in that cycle. For Deng, survival was not a victory. It was a temporary, fragile condition, burdened with responsibility. He knew what he had witnessed when ideology was granted absolute power of judgment. Thus, the first thing he preserved was not resentment, but a healthy skepticism toward any system that claimed infallibility. This skepticism was not loud. It did not demand symbolic justice. It quietly asked a single question: how can society avoid recreating the conditions that once destroyed human beings in this way? During his years on the margins, Deng gained a rare opportunity to observe without acting. He saw how fear turned people into instruments of mutual surveillance. He saw how morality was reduced to compliance. From this, he drew a foundational conclusion. When a system demands purity, people learn to pretend, not because they are evil, but because they want to survive. And it is this pretense that corrodes any lasting trust. Not, however, did Deng conclude that human beings are weak. He concluded that systems must be designed for people as they actually are, not as idealized moral archetypes. A system can function only when it does not require people to be heroic every day. From this point forward, Deng's thinking became clearer than ever. The purpose of politics is not to produce perfect human beings, but to reduce the conditions that force people to do terrible things in order to live. Surviving without becoming sanctified was also a psychologically disciplined choice. It required the ability not to retell one's own suffering as myth. Deng rarely spoke of the years of purges, not because he had forgotten, but because he understood the weight of those memories. He did not want them to become the foundation for emotionally driven decisions in the future. Instead, he allowed memory to function as a quiet boundary, reminding him that any power, if left unchecked, can return to crush those who serve it. This stance set Deng apart from many historical figures who passed through tragedy. He did not seek veneration. He did not construct a new salvational narrative. He accepted a far less glamorous role, that of a repairer. Repair brings no immediate glory. It requires patience, compromise, and the acceptance of contradiction. But Deng understood that only repair can prevent history from repeating its most brutal mistakes. Here we see clearly why Deng did not believe in symbolic reckonings with the past. He did not deny the importance of confronting error, but he distrusted moral rituals unaccompanied by structural change. For him, more important than condemnation was transforming how systems made decisions, how information flowed back upward, and how human beings were protected from collective fanaticism. These were dry, unemotional problems, and precisely for that reason, they were durable. Deng's refusal of sanctification also explains why he later resisted cultivating a cult of personality. He had seen firsthand what happens when a single individual is elevated into an infallible symbol. He did not wish to become the emotional center of a nation. He wanted to be an operational anchor, where decisions were weighed by consequences rather than belief. Power in this understanding does not need to be loved. It only needs to be restrained. As time passed and the political context slowly shifted, it was precisely this clarity that prepared Deng for a role few others could fulfill. He did not return as someone demanding justice for the past. He returned as someone calm enough to repair the present, without demolishing symbols, without overturning memory, without insisting on total purification, only through small, cautious steps grounded in reality and in society's limits of endurance. And because he had survived without becoming sanctified, Deng Xiaoping could enter the next stage of Chinese history with a rare advantage. He did not need to prove his moral righteousness. He needed only to show that society could function better. In the next part, when Mao passes away and a vacuum of power opens, we will see why a man without a salvational aura became the most fitting choice for a nation exhausted by absolute promises. When Mao Zedong passed away, China did not immediately step into a new era. It stepped into a void of power, a void of belief, and most importantly, a void in the ability to imagine the future. After decades of living under the blinding light of a single symbol, society suddenly found itself in an unfamiliar state. There was no longer anyone to believe in absolutely, yet there was still not enough courage to doubt openly. That void was not quiet. It was heavy, laden with unnamed memories. The Great Leap Forward had not yet been spoken of truthfully. The Cultural Revolution had not yet been digested. The wounds remained, but society did not know what language to use to face them. To condemn too forcefully risked undermining the foundations of legitimacy. To remain silent for too long left the danger of repeating mistakes hanging in the air. China, at that moment, resembled a person waking from a long nightmare, remembering the fear vividly, but unsure how to recount it. In such a context, power was no longer alluring. It was a burden. Anyone who stepped forward had to face two parallel anxieties: change too quickly, and society might fall into chaos. Preserve the status quo for too long, and society would continue to exhaust itself. No one wanted to become a second Mao, yet no one knew how to govern without relying on an absolute symbol. The power vacuum, therefore, was not merely a personnel problem, but a crisis of leadership models. Deng Xiaoping returned to the political center in this context, not as a victor, but as someone who had survived long enough to understand the cost of both extremes. He did not represent a dramatic rupture with the past, nor did he represent unconditional continuity. What made Deng suitable was not formal authority, but memory. He carried within him the memory of what happens when belief is pushed too far, and that memory made him cautious in an almost instinctive way. Notably, Chinese society at this point no longer yearned for grand promises. After decades of constant mobilization, people were tired. They did not need more historical geniuses. They needed stability. They needed to know what they would eat tomorrow, what they would do, how they would live. This shift in social psychology produced an intriguing paradox. The person with the least aura became the most trustworthy, and Deng Xiaoping, with his discreet practical style and his refusal of personal worship, stepped naturally into that void. The power vacuum after Mao was also a vacuum of language. Old words, revolution, struggle, purity, no longer generate the same positive emotions as before. Yet new words, reform, market, experimentation, still felt unsafe to speak aloud. Deng understood this very clearly. He did not attempt to change political language overnight. He allowed it to drift slowly, from praising belief toward accepting reality. This was not a rhetorical overthrow, but a process of gradually hollowing out the old discourse. The traumatic memory of the Cultural Revolution hovered like a cloud over every decision. It was not fully articulated, but it was present in the fear of chaos. Deng did not use that memory to justify personal power. He used it as an implicit moral boundary. This society could not endure another total mobilization. Any reform that shook the social structure too violently risked reopening wounds that had not yet healed. Here, the difference between Deng and other potential leaders became clear. While some continued to seek legitimacy by tying themselves to Mao's legacy, Deng chose another path, not denying the symbol, but drawing energy away from it. He did not topple statues, rename institutions, or rewrite history in a radical fashion. He let the symbol stand still, while ensuring it no longer determined everything. This was a subtle art of power. one that could only be practiced by someone who deeply understood the cost of shattering collective memory. The power vacuum also forced Deng to confront a difficult question: how to change without triggering the system's defensive reflexes. His answer lay not in grand declarations, but in small, reversible steps. Instead of proclaiming a new truth, he spoke of experimentation. Instead of asserting the correct path, he allowed for error within controllable limits. This was the way chosen by someone who had survived irreparable mistakes. Looking back, the post-Mao period was not the moment Deng Xiaoping seized power. It was the moment power found him, not because he promised a glorious future, but because he promised reminding nothing beyond what society could endure. In a country haunted by the catastrophic memory of blind belief, caution itself became a new form of courage. And from that void, a profound shift began to take shape, not by overthrowing Mao in words, but by changing the standard by which truth was judged. In the next part, when Deng puts forward the seemingly simple proposition, "Practice is the sole criterion of truth," we will see that it was not merely a sentence, but a quiet yet decisive pivot, one that opened the way for a completely different China over the half-century that followed.
There is no moral dimension to it. It is a simple, beautiful fact. Let's explore this through your direct sensory experience right now. Bring your awareness to the quiet air in your room. With your next inhale, notice how that air willingly flows into your lungs. You are displacing a certain volume of air to make room for your breath. The air does not complain. It does not resist. It moves aside, creating the space for you to receive the oxygen you need to live. It is a perfect, harmonious exchange. You are not taking the air. You are participating in the great cycle of breath that connects all living things. Feel the gentle, unapologetic nature of this process. The simple in-breath, occupying space. The simple out-breath, releasing it. There is no apology needed for this fundamental act of being alive. Now, bring your awareness to the warmth your body is creating. Even as you lie still, your metabolism is generating a gentle heat, a life force that radiates from you into your immediate environment. You are creating a small, personal climate under your blankets. This warmth occupies the space around you. It is a sign of your vitality. It is a quiet, steady broadcast of your presence. Like a small, sleeping sun, you emanate a gentle energy. You do not need to apologize for this warmth. It is a natural and wonderful property of your being. Can you feel it? The subtle aura of heat your body produces? Rest in that warmth. It is the signature of your life, peacefully occupying its corner of the universe. Let your attention now drift to the physical presence of your body in the bed. Feel the length of you, from the top of your head to the tips of your toes. Feel the width of you, from shoulder to shoulder. Feel the gentle, solid weight of you pressing down into the mattress. You are occupying this space. The mattress is yielding to you, conforming to your shape, holding you. This is a perfect illustration of how the world makes space for you. You do not have to fight for it. You simply have to be, and the space is there. The bed is not groaning under your weight, complaining about your presence. It is simply doing its job, supporting the body that occupies it. Let your body relax even more fully into this support. Release the subtle tension that comes from feeling like an intruder. You are not an intruder in your own bed. You are not an intruder in your own life. You belong here. This space is yours. The old habit of apologizing for your presence creates a kind of energetic dissonance. Your body is physically here, occupying space, while your mind is mentally apologizing for it. This creates a split, a lack of integration. It's like one part of you is saying, "I am here," and another part is saying, "I'm sorry for being here." This inner conflict is exhausting. The practice tonight is to bring these two parts into harmony. It is the practice of aligning your mind.
Impact. For society, this was a liberation. For power, it was a constraint. And for that reason, it was more dangerous than any direct criticism. Deng did not demand immediate belief in the new principle. He allowed experimentation. Experiments on a small scale. Experiments at the local level. Experiments with the possibility of reversal if they failed. Here we see clearly the imprint of someone who had survived irreparable mistakes. He detested decisions without an exit. Practice, in Deng's understanding, was not an all-or-nothing gamble. It was a continuous testing process in which truth was always provisional and adjustable. This change of standard also transformed the relationship between the center and the localities. When results became the measure, local initiative was granted space, not to challenge the center, but to provide living data. The center no longer needed to be theoretically correct first. It needed to be correct after seeing what worked. This was a subtle inversion of power, from command to feedback, from imposition to learning. For a society exhausted by absolute promises, the modesty of this principle offered a sense of safety. It did not demand blind faith. It required only observation. It allowed people to breathe. And within that breathing space, creative energy returned, not in the form of movements, but as small, steady improvements. Yet Deng also understood that a principle, however sound, is only a framework. To bring it into life requires concrete steps, without fanfare, without spectacle. Saying that practice is the criterion is one thing. Turning it into a daily way of working is another, harder, slower, and more easily doubted. And so, once the proposition had been put forward and accepted widely enough, Deng did not stop at philosophy. He moved into action, cautious, incremental, and always leaving room for correction. In the next part, we will see this principle translated into life through a method deeply characteristic of Deng Xiaoping: reform without trumpets, quiet experiments, household contracts, special zones, cautious opening, where truth was not proclaimed, but tested day by day in reality. Reform, in many people's imagination, is often associated with grand declarations and clearly named historical moments. But for Deng Xiaoping, reform began in precisely the opposite way, without fanfare, without ceremony, without proclamations of rupture. Having already shifted the standard of truth toward practice, he understood that the greatest danger was not moving slowly, but making noise. A society that had just emerged from the convulsions of blind belief did not need more shouting. It needed changes small enough not to trigger fear, yet real enough to make a difference in everyday life. Deng's reform, therefore, took the form of discrete experimentation. No one announced that China was embarking on a new path. No one invoked capitalism or betrayal. Everything was framed as technical adjustments, temporary solutions, trials meant to address specific problems. The household responsibility system in agriculture was not celebrated as an ideological breakthrough. It was simply permitted because peasants needed to eat. Special economic zones were not introduced as gateways to another world. They were described as laboratories, places where failure was allowed without shaking the entire system. Here, Deng's wisdom revealed itself most clearly. He understood that language determines the system's reflexes. Call a policy a major reform, and it immediately triggers defensive reactions from those who fear losing legitimacy. Call it a limited experiment, and it gains the chance to survive long enough to prove its effectiveness. Deng did not need to win arguments. He needed policies to endure over time, and to achieve that, he accepted ambiguity by design. Reform without trumpets was also Deng's way of protecting society from itself. After decades of collective mobilization, people had grown accustomed to being asked to sacrifice for lofty goals. Deng did not want to repeat that pattern. He did not call for a reformist spirit. He did not ask people to believe in a radiant future. He simply opened small spaces in which people could improve their lives on their own, and then let results speak in place of intentions. When incomes rose, when production recovered, confidence returned. Not confidence in an ideal, but confidence in the possibility of living. This produced a profound reversal in how power operated. Previously, policy came first, and life followed. Now, life became the evidence that allowed policy to continue. When the household responsibility system raised productivity, it was expanded. When special zones attracted investment, they were replicated. There were no declarations of victory, only the slow accumulation of concrete results. It was precisely this slowness that made Deng's reforms more durable than any prior campaign. Reform without trumpets was also a way of dispersing risk. Instead of betting the entire society on a single comprehensive plan, Deng allowed multiple paths to exist in parallel. If one experiment failed, it could be halted without moral justification. If it succeeded, it generated its own reason to continue. This was the thinking of someone who had witnessed the cost of decisions with no exit. Deng did not seek absolute correctness. He sought the capacity to correct mistakes. Notably, throughout this process, Deng rarely stepped forward to claim credit. He did not attach reform to his own name. He did not construct a personal image as the architect of the future. On the contrary, he allowed localities, collectives, and individuals who directly benefited from reform to become the living evidence. His power lay in allowing this to happen, not in being acknowledged for it. This was a very different kind of power, the power of withdrawal, so that the system could advance. Yet reform without trumpets was not reform without contradiction. New inequalities emerged. Regional disparities widened. Ethical questions arose. Deng did not deny these realities, but he placed them within a different order of priority. First, society had to come back to life. Only then could distribution and justice be debated. This was not a dismissal of justice, but a practical choice by someone who understood that justice cannot exist amid prolonged poverty. It was precisely this practicality that gave Deng's reforms little idealistic beauty, but great historical endurance. They did not promise a paradise. They merely opened a way out of deadlock. And in a society wounded by promises that were too grand, this modesty became a new form of ethics, the ethics of not inflicting further harm. Looking back, we can see that Deng Xiaoping's reform without trumpets was not merely an economic strategy. It was the continuation of the logic of his entire life. From a poor boy in Sichuan, to a factory worker in France, to a backstage cadre, to a victim of the Cultural Revolution, and finally to a repairer of history. Each step avoided the spotlight, yet each left its mark. And precisely because reform unfolded quietly, Its consequences spread widely. Society began to learn how to live with new contradictions, market forces and socialism, rapid enrichment and inequality, and opening up and control. These contradictions were not resolved immediately. They were simply allowed to exist, something Mao could not accept, but Deng could. In the next part, when reform has advanced far enough that there is no turning back, the story will move to another level. China will no longer merely be experimenting. It will begin to shape a long-term model in which contradictions are no longer things to be eliminated, but things to be managed. That is when Chinese society learns to live with its own paradoxes, and when the legacy of Deng Xiaoping enters its most decisive phase. When reform had advanced far enough that there was no turning back, China entered a new phase, no longer one of experimentation, but of coexistence. Coexistence with things once considered irreconcilable. Coexistence with opposing forces pulling in different directions. And above all, coexistence with an uncomfortable truth. No pure model could any longer fit a society moving at such speed. This part is not about a specific policy, but about a shift in historical mentality. The moment China learned how to live with contradiction. Under Mao, contradiction was something to be resolved decisively. The world had to be clear, right or wrong, revolutionary or counter-revolutionary. Contradiction was seen as a sign of deviation, something to be purged through mobilization and discipline. But after Deng Xiaoping's reforms, contradiction did not disappear. On the contrary, it appeared everywhere. Socialism alongside the market, a strong party alongside individuals growing wealthy, ideal equality alongside real disparity. What was new was not the existence of contradiction, but the way society confronted it. Deng understood that any attempt to eliminate contradiction through sheer will would only reproduce violence. He did not believe history could return to a state of purity. And so, instead of resolving the contradiction with a new absolute truth, he chose to manage it. This was a profound shift in thinking, from politics as moral absolutism to politics as the art of balance. The question was no longer, who is completely right, but what can be tolerated in the present. In this model, the market was not treated as an ideological enemy, but as a tool for generating momentum. Getting rich was no longer automatically equated with betrayal, as long as it did not undermine stability. The state did not retreat from society, yet it no longer sought to control every corner of daily life. Under Deng's imprint, China began to function as a hybrid system, inelegant in theory, but effective in practice. This very inelegance became its advantage. It allowed flexibility, adjustment, and survival. Living with contradiction also meant accepting controlled insecurity. As society opened up, new inequalities emerged. As individuals gained room to accumulate wealth, regional gaps widened. Deng did not deny these consequences. He simply placed them within a different order of priorities. An equal but impoverished society was no longer a viable option. A developing society, even if unequal, still retained the capacity to correct itself. It was a difficult choice, but one that reflected a deep understanding of society's limits after decades of suffering. More importantly, Deng did not ask society to believe in the new model. He asked only that it work. There were no oaths of loyalty to the market, no declarations of rupture with socialism. The two coexisted in a state of permanent tension, and within that tension, society learned a new skill, tolerating inconsistency. This is a rare political skill, yet an essential one for modern societies. This shift also transformed how power was understood. Power was no longer the ability to generate absolute consensus, but the ability to prevent contradictions from crossing the threshold into explosion. Stability no longer meant stasis, but keeping opposing forces from destroying one another. Deng did not promise an ideally harmonious society. He sought only to ensure that the inevitable conflicts of development did not turn into a political catastrophe. This required a very different kind of discipline from leadership, the discipline of not intervening too much. Not every contradiction needed immediate resolution. Not every injustice could be corrected at once. Deng accepted that some problems would persist for a long time, as long as they did not rupture the overall structure. This was a choice easily criticized on moral grounds, yet it reflected a historical reality. No society can fix everything at the same time. Within this space, China began to develop a new rhythm of life. People were no longer promised paradise. They were given an opportunity. That opportunity was uneven, not perfectly just, but real enough to change behavior. And when behavior changes, society follows. Deng trusted this chain reaction more than any moral appeal. He understood that lasting change always begins with small things, not with collective enlightenment. Living with contradiction was also Deng's way of protecting the system from itself. A system that refuses to accept contradiction will sooner or later divide the world into friends and enemies. A system that accepts contradiction is forced to learn compromise, listening, and adjustment. This is not weakness, but political maturity. After decades of extremism, China began to enter that stage of maturity, not loudly, not declaratively, but very tangibly. Looking back, China learning to live with contradiction is not an achievement that can be measured in years. It is a historical capacity, formed gradually. That capacity allowed China to grow rapidly without collapsing, to open deeply while preserving its power structure, and to accept paradoxes without trying to erase them through violence. This is Deng Xiaoping's deepest imprint, not in growth figures, but in the way a society learned restraint. Yet living with contradiction does not mean avoiding choice. There are moments when contradictions exceed the threshold of endurance, forcing power to intervene. And when that happens, every pragmatic principle is tested to its limit. In the next part, we will enter such a moment, Tiananmen 1989, where Deng Xiaoping had to make a cold decision that exposed the ultimate limits of reform and laid the foundation for a model of growth first, democracy later, that would shape China for decades to come. Tiananmen in 1989 was the moment when all the accumulated contradictions of reform were forced into the open, no longer confined to quiet experimentation, no longer contained within differences that could be managed through growth. Contradiction this time stepped into the square, between the desire for change and the fear of chaos, between the language of ideals and the discipline of power, between a society opening up and a system not yet ready to unmoor. For Deng Xiaoping, this was not a simple question of right and wrong. It was the limit of reform. To understand the decision of 1989, one must return to the intellectual foundation that had guided Deng throughout his life. He believed in practice, in society's capacity for endurance, and in avoiding decisions with no exit. His reforms were always designed to be stoppable, adjustable, and reversible. But social movements, once they cross a certain threshold, no longer follow the logic of experimentation. They carry emotions, symbols, and expectations far beyond what a system can absorb at speed. For many young people at the time, economic reform naturally gave rise to questions of political reform. If the market could be experimented with, why not power? If daily life could open up, why not voices? These questions were not unreasonable. They were the natural consequence of a society that had tasted change. But to Deng, they came too quickly, and more importantly, they arrived within a structure that lacked safe mechanisms of absorption. What he saw there was the greatest danger China had ever faced in history, the spread of chaos. Deng did not idealize order. He had witnessed false order collapse during the Great Leap Forward, and moral order crush human beings during the Cultural Revolution. Precisely because of this, he was deeply wary of moments when collective emotion surged beyond the capacity for management. For him, the question was not, are these demands legitimate? But, can society endure this process of transition? When those two questions yielded different answers, Deng chose stability. The decision was cold, and Deng did not attempt to justify it in moral language. He did not call it a victory. He saw it as a threshold, Hal apparently halting a movement that he believed, if allowed to continue, would trigger a chain reaction beyond control. This was the logic of a manager rather than a preacher. When a system lacks shock absorbers, acceleration is self-destruction. In making this choice, Deng wagered on temporary order in order to preserve space for economic reform to continue. Tiananmen thus exposed the deepest contradiction of the Deng model: opening without unlocking, development without simultaneous democratization. This was not an accidental contradiction, but a conscious choice. Deng believed that growth would create a material foundation, and from that foundation, society would gradually learn to demand and help manage new rights. He believed in sequence, and he feared the cost of reversing that sequence, a cost China had already paid far too dearly. Not everyone accepted this logic, and Deng himself understood that the decision would define his legacy in an incomplete way. Yet what is striking is that he did not evade its consequences. He did not seek to erase memory. He left behind a clear model: growth first, democracy later, not as a universal truth, but as a path he believed to be less painful in China's specific circumstances. After 1989, economic reform did not stop. It accelerated. This was not a denial of political questions, but a postponement of them, grounded in the belief that a wealthier, more complex society would be better equipped to handle contradiction. Deng wagered on time, what he believed to be the ally of durable change. Time, for him, was the only way to transform contradiction into a capacity for management, rather than an explosion. Tiananmen also revealed Deng's personal limits. He was a man of reality, but also a man of boundaries. There were things he was willing to try, and things he was not willing to risk. Reform in his hands was not a second revolution. It was a process of pain reduction for a society exhausted by shocks. When faced with the prospect of another shock, he chose to break hard. To judge Tiananmen solely through moral condemnation is to miss the historical depth of that choice. To judge it solely through effectiveness is to overlook the pain it inflicted. The truth lies in between, where the limits of reform were exposed and where a leader had to choose among options that all carried a price. Deng chose the price he believed would do less damage to the social foundation in the long run. History will continue to debate that choice. But one thing cannot be denied. From that moment on, China's path was clearly framed. And precisely because of this choice of limits, Deng Xiaoping began to withdraw, not from influence but from symbolic centrality. He allowed the system to continue operating on the inertia of reform, while he himself stepped away from the spotlight. In the next part, as Deng leaves the center of power, we will see something rare in modern history. A leader with the greatest influence choosing to turn himself into the background, so that the system could remain, and so that the future could answer questions the present could not yet resolve. After Tiananmen, Deng Xiaoping did not place himself at the center of explanation, nor did he step forward as a symbol to justify a controversial choice. On the contrary, he withdrew quietly, decisively, and in a way entirely consistent with how he had faced power throughout his life. But this was not the withdrawal of a weary man. It was a withdrawal by design, so that something more important could remain: the system. In modern history, few leaders have deliberately chosen to fade themselves after shaping the trajectory of an entire nation. Power usually comes with the desire to be remembered, defended, and continuously present in every decision. Deng was different. He understood that if reform were tied too closely to a single name, it would become fragile. Once the person disappeared, everything could be reversed. Thus, his most strategic choice was not to hold on to power, but to remove power from himself. Deng did not build a cult of personality. He did not need enormous portraits. He did not leave behind pronouncements that carried the weight of sacred commandments. Instead, he left behind a way of operating, a system accustomed to experimentation, accustomed to adjustment, accustomed to measuring outcomes rather than defending intentions. When people grow used to a method, they no longer need the initiator to stand at the front. This is a rare kind of legacy, the legacy of political habit. Deng's withdrawal also reflected a deep understanding of China's collective memory. After Mao, society had paid an enormous price for binding national destiny to a single individual. Deng did not want to repeat that pattern, even if the individual was himself. He did not want reform to be seen as the will of Deng Xiaoping, but as the only reasonable path left under specific historical conditions. Once reform was no longer attached to a person, it became much harder to reverse. Importantly, Deng did not withdraw to wash his hands of responsibility. His influence remained, but indirectly, in the principle that practice is the criterion of truth, in the permission granted to local experimentation, in the prioritization of stability to sustain growth. He did not need to occupy the highest office to shape the direction. The system had been placed on its trajectory, and its inertia was strong enough to keep it moving. Deng's power lay in that inertia, not in titles. This withdrawal was also an implicit statement about the limits of power. Deng understood that no model is perfect, and no decision is immune to consequences. He therefore did not seek to control the future. He left behind a framework and accepted that later generations would have to confront new contradictions in their own way. This is a rare humility in political history, acknowledging that one's role is to open a path, not to walk it for everyone. Looking back, the contrast between Mao and Deng is especially clear at this moment. Mao built a ship out of will and stood at its prow to point the direction. Deng was different. He changed the ship's course, then stepped down, allowing the crew to learn how to adjust to the current. One believed that history must be continuously guided. The other believed that history, once placed on the right trajectory, could operate on its own for a long time. The system remains also meant that the contradictions Deng accepted would not disappear. The market would continue to generate inequality. Opening up would continue to create social tension. Stability would continue to raise questions about freedom. Deng did not resolve these contradictions. He only ensured that they were managed rather than denied. This was not an ideal solution, but the most realistic one for a populous society deeply scarred by historical shocks. Deng's withdrawal also made his legacy harder to grasp. There was no clear moment of triumph, no day when reform was completed. There was only a gradually emerging reality. China continued to grow, continued to open up, continued to change, within a framework Deng had established, even as his name appeared less and less in specific decisions. This was the legacy of absence, quiet, yet enduring power. From the perspective of historical psychology, this may have been the choice most consistent with Deng Xiaoping's character. He had never sought the spotlight. He had always worked from behind, repairing, adjusting, and accepting the absence of affection. When the time came to withdraw, he did so in the same manner, without appeals, without complaints, without grand final words. He believed that if a system required a single individual to survive, then that system had failed from the start. And for that very reason, when Deng left the center of power, the story did not close. It opened. It opened onto a period in which China lived within his legacy, sometimes without realizing it, sometimes disputing it, sometimes denying it, yet still operating within the framework he had constructed. In the next part, as we look back across the entire journey, we will draw a concluding comparison. Mao built the ship. Deng changed its course. In order to better understand how these two men, with two very different ways of believing in history, together shaped China in a way neither of them could ever fully have predicted. To understand why China today has taken its present shape, one cannot look at a single individual alone. History rarely operates according to the logic of solitary heroes. It is shaped by a chain of successive choices, in which each figure leaves behind an inertia that those who follow must confront. Within that chain, Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping are not simple opposites. There are two moments in the same journey, one who built the ship and one who changed its course. Mao built the ship in a historical context where survival itself was a victory. Mao's China was a China that needed unification, needed a moral center, needed a will strong enough to overcome division, invasion, and chaos. That ship was constructed out of absolute belief. Belief that history could be forced forward, that human beings could be mobilized beyond their limits. In that period, belief was not merely a tool, it was fuel. And Mao was a man who knew how to ignite that fuel. It cannot be denied that without Mao's ship, there would have been no space for later choices. He created a modern state, established sovereignty, and gave millions of people, for the first time, a sense of belonging to a shared project. Yet that ship also carried the imprint of its builder. It was designed for speed and mobilization, not for a long voyage. It ran well when breakthroughs were needed, but it became dangerous when navigating complex waters that required constant adjustment. Deng Xiaoping stepped onto that ship, not as its original captain, but as someone who had lived long enough to hear the cracks in its hull. He did not destroy the ship. He did not build a new one. He understood that doing so would trigger chaos, something Chinese society could no longer endure. Instead, Deng did something far less dramatic, yet far more decisive. He changed the direction. Changing direction demands a different kind of courage than building from scratch. It does not allow a clean break with the past. It requires living with what already exists, including its flaws. Deng accepted the ship as it was built, but he changed how it was steered, from speed to stability, from mobilization to management, from absolute belief to practical experimentation. There were no trumpets to announce it, only small, continuous adjustments, just enough to keep the ship from crashing into the rocks. Comparing Mao and Deng, therefore, should not descend into simple moral judgment. Mao was not wrong because he believed. Deng was not right because he doubted. Each served a different historical moment. Mao was necessary during the founding phase, when society needed a powerful pull to escape disintegration. Deng was necessary in the post-shock phase, when society needed recovery and accumulation. One represented the force of beginnings, the other embodied the discipline of continuation. The fundamental difference lay in how they viewed human beings. Mao believed that people could be elevated to the level of
toward the dark shape of the mountain road, hoping something, anything, would appear to help her. The snow continued to fall harder, and the sound of the truck grew louder behind her, but she kept moving, forcing one foot in front of the other, determined not to stop. She didn't know what waited beyond that curve, but she prayed it was something better than what was behind her, and she kept running.
50 years is a span long enough for history to grow quieter, for early controversies to settle, and for the true consequences of a choice to gradually reveal themselves. Looking at China today, one may disagree on many points, but it is difficult to deny a foundational reality. The country is living within the trajectory set by Deng Xiaoping, not as a detailed blueprint, but as a durable operating logic, deeply embedded in how society thinks, works, and confronts contradiction. Deng's China is wealthier, stronger, and more complex than anything 20th century imagination could have fully conceived. Hundreds of millions have been lifted out of poverty. Cities have risen at breathtaking speed. Markets have become an ordinary part of daily life. Yet alongside these changes are paradoxes that cannot be ignored. Widening inequality, intense social pressure, and a persistent tension between economic growth and political control. These are not unintended side effects. They are the inevitable remainder of a historical choice. What is striking is that China does not deny these contradictions. It lives with them. Rather than attempting to erase paradox through a new overarching truth, the system has learned to manage them. Growth to maintain stability, stability to sustain further growth. This is the central loop of post-Deng China. It may lack theoretical elegance, but it is effective in terms of power. And precisely because of that effectiveness, the model has endured far longer than many initially predicted. 50 years on, Deng's imprint is clearest in this. China no longer operates through all-encompassing mass campaigns. There is no great leap forward, no cultural revolution. In their place are governance, data, and incremental policy adjustment. Mistakes still occur, but they rarely take on a totalizing, destructive scale. This represents a profound shift in how power is exercised, from mobilizing emotion to managing risk. And that is Deng's most practical legacy. Deng's China is also a nation in constant experimentation. From special economic zones to state-owned enterprise reform, from recalibrating the roles of market and state, everything bears the mark of a try, then revise mentality. There are no declarations of perfection, no final model, only continuous flexibility, sometimes confusing, but sufficient to prevent the system from hardening. In a volatile world, this very lack of rigidity has become an advantage. Yet living within Deng's trajectory also means bearing its costs. Rapid growth generates fierce competition. Open markets create opportunity, but also leave many with a sense of being left behind. The prioritization of stability results in a tightly managed political space. Deng's China is not a paradise. It is a society that functions efficiently under strain, where success and anxiety move side by side. On the international stage, Deng's legacy has made China an inescapable factor. Global economic integration technological learning, and participation in supply chains all stem from a cautious yet resolute opening. China did not enter the world armed with ideals, but with interests and capacity. That approach enabled a rapid rise while also producing enduring strategic frictions, an outcome Deng likely anticipated but could never fully control. What is notable is that despite profound change, core political language remains familiar. Socialism is still invoked. The party's leadership role is still affirmed. Yet the substance within these concepts has shifted. They are no longer instruments for mobilizing unlimited sacrifice, but tools for managing a complex society over the long term. This is precisely how Deng emptied ideology, preserving form to maintain stability, while transforming substance so society could function. 50 years on, one may debate whether Deng's China is a success or a failure, a model or an exception. But such questions may miss what matters more. Deng's China is a coherent outcome. It neither betrayed its past nor copied the West. It followed a distinct path, shaped by traumatic memory, caution, and a fear of repeating historical shocks. For many Chinese people, Deng's legacy does not appear as a statue or a myth. It appears in everyday life, in work, in markets, in practical choices, rather than ideals. It is a legacy that does not demand praise, yet is difficult to deny. And it is precisely this quiet presence that makes it durable. As history moves far enough forward, questions of absolute right and wrong gradually give way to another. Has society learned how not to destroy itself again? Deng's China, with all its contradictions and tensions, has avoided the self-destructive catastrophes that marked the previous century. That does not make it perfect, but it makes it worth reflecting upon. And as we enter the final part of this story, the question no longer rests solely with China, but with ourselves, those living in a world partly shaped by Deng's choices. In the closing lullaby, we will return to a lighter, yet deeper reflection. Is the best form of power one that does not need to be loved, does not need to be worshipped, but only needs to be lucid enough not to wound history one more time? When a story reaches its end, history no longer speaks through loud events. It lowers its voice. It slows down. It resembles the final moment of a long day, when people no longer have the strength to argue about right and wrong, victory and defeat, and only wish to understand what truly remains. With Deng Xiaoping, what remains is neither a myth nor a beautiful dream. It is a quiet, yet persistent question. Must power be loved in order to have value? Deng Xiaoping was never an easily likable figure in the conventional sense of history. He did not create grand, stirring moments that entered collective memory as moral symbols. He left behind no lines that made crowds weep. He did not even seek to be remembered as a savior. If there is something that made him distinctive, it is precisely that he did not need to be loved. Throughout his life, Deng stood in an uncomfortable position, too pragmatic to be a preacher, too cautious to be a hero, too quiet to become an emotional symbol. He understood very well the power of being adored, and understood just as clearly the price that must be paid when power depends on worship to survive. He had lived in the shadow of that worship, and witnessed the catastrophes it produced, catastrophes no one dared to stop. And from that experience he chose a different path. Power, as Deng understood it, was not the ability to make people believe, but the ability to prevent society from injuring itself yet again. It is a modest, almost cold definition, yet one rooted in deep compassion. For only those who have seen human beings crushed by lofty ideals can understand that sometimes the most humane act is not to call for sacrifice, but to reduce the reasons that force people to sacrifice at all. Deng did not leave behind a complete ideology. He left behind an attitude, a habit of distrusting answers that are too beautiful, too quick, too certain. He did not say that humanity has no need for ideals. He only said, through his entire life, that ideals, if not tested against reality and human limits, will become violence. And therefore, the best form of power is not the power that makes people believe, but the power that knows when to stop. Perhaps that is why Deng Xiaoping was never loved in the way Mao once was. And yet, for that very reason, today's world, from factories and cities to supply chains and geopolitical order, continues to operate along the trajectory he set. His legacy does not reside in an emotionally charged collective memory. It resides in everyday life, where people work, exchange, calculate, and carry on. It is an unromantic legacy, but a resilient one. Looking back across the entire journey, we can see that Deng was not the winner of every moral debate, but he did win another kind of struggle, the struggle against the seduction of absolute power. He did not believe society needed a permanent spiritual father. He believed it needed a system lucid enough to correct itself, even when doing so brought no glory to any individual. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson Deng Xiaoping leaves behind, not only for China, but for any society that has once been swept up by absolute promises. Power does not need to be loved. Power does not need to be worshipped. Power only needs to be humble enough not to mistake itself for truth, and patient enough to place human beings, with all their limitations, back at the center of life, when night has deepened and the story comes to a close. What remains is not a definitive conclusion, but a silence. In that silence, we may ask ourselves, not about Deng Xiaoping, but about the world we are living in. Are the powers shaping our lives today lucid enough not to demand worship? Are they brave enough to accept not being loved, as long as society is made to function with less pain? And if those questions slow your breathing, if history in the night invites reflection without argument, then that is precisely the spirit deep sleep of power seeks to offer. Not to deliver final answers, but to remind us that sometimes a society's peaceful sleep begins when power learns to speak more softly.